This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey there, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 176 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. I am so excited to bring you the first episode in the Reading is Fundamental series, which is part of a partnership I'm doing along with the B Podcast Network and Reading is Fundamental in the month of September. What is going to be happening is that I will be publishing episodes that are related to reading and literacy in the month of September as part of a campaign that focuses on getting evidence-based literacy instruction into the hands of educators and families, as well as increasing book equity. Reading is Fundamental is a nonprofit that focuses on connecting educators and families with materials and training aligned with evidence-based literacy instruction, as well as offering unique book ownership solutions for professionals and families to address book equity issues. You can learn more about the campaign in the show notes, as well as Reading is Fundamental. I will also be publishing 2 episodes a week in the month of September as part of this campaign, which is different from my normal schedule of just publishing episodes on Wednesday. This first episode is about building the language for reading, writing, and spelling, and my guest is Dr. Jan Wasowicz. The science of reading is trending, but in order for professionals to engage in effective instruction, they need to understand that literacy also includes spelling and writing. Writing, spelling, and reading are interconnected, and the growing body of research continues to show that these skills need to be taught explicitly. And that's why I invited Dr. Wasowicz to episode 176 to discuss the Language and Literacy Network, a framework she's created to help professionals better understand the connections between reading, writing, spelling, and language. Dr. Jan Wasowicz has more than 40 years of experience as a speech, language, literacy, and learning specialist, working with students in a variety of educational settings, including public schools, Head Start programs, and private practice. Dr. Wasowicz is frequently invited to speak about best practices in literacy assessment and instruction, and has taught numerous undergraduate and graduate courses, holding faculty positions at Northwestern University, Elmhurst College, Russ Presbyterian, St. Luke's Medical Center, and Governor State University. Her credits include articles published in scholarly journals and U.S. patents for her inventions of literacy software programs, including Earobics and Spelling Performance Evaluation for Language and Literacy, known as SPELL-3. Dr. Wasowicz is an author of Spell Links to Reading and Writing and lead moderator of the Spell Talk Multidisciplinary Professional Listserv, which I highly recommend that you check it out. I have linked to it in the show notes. She also currently serves as an advisory board member of the Reading League of Illinois and an external consultant for Purdue University's interdisciplinary initiative to strengthen teacher preparation using science-based methods. Dr. Wasowicz is an ASHA certified, Illinois licensed, and Florida licensed speech-language pathologist and an ASHA board certified specialist in child language, and she holds a professional educator license with multiple endorsements from the State Teacher Certification Board of Illinois. She is the founder, president, and CEO of Spell Links Learning by Design Incorporated, and she maintains a small private practice in Illinois via telepractice and in Florida, serving students with oral and written language disorders. In this conversation, we discuss Do we need a writing rope to supplement the reading rope, or should reading, writing, and language be woven into one literacy framework? Pragmatics, executive functioning, and metalinguistic awareness. How do these components fit into effective literacy instruction? Does working on reading improve spelling? Does working on spelling improve reading? How do these things fit together? Should professionals work on linguistic skills in stages? When and how should professionals start working on skills like morphology in elementary school? And we also define approaches like print to speech, speech to print, what those terms mean, and give some specific examples. Definitely check the show notes to learn about all the places you can go to connect with Dr. Wasowicz, to learn about the Language and Literacy Network, as well as Spell Links and the Spell Talk listserv. Also, a quick reminder, in the month of September, from September 15th through October 15th, you can get 25% off of either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. All you need to do to get that special rate is to enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page to get that special rate. Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program that helps SLPs create a framework for language therapy. You can learn more about that program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. And the School of Clinical Leadership is my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning programming in place on their school teams. And you can learn more about that program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. Now, please enjoy this interview with Dr. Jan Wasowicz. Today, I am joined by Dr. Jan Wasowicz from Spell Links and Learning by Design. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you.
Yeah, so I know we have a lot we wanted to talk about today. I thought the best place to start is tell us about yourself, like the history of your career up until this point and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so I like to say I came into literacy the way our students do, which is through oral language first. I am a speech language pathologist. That is my clinical background, my academic training. And back in the early 1990s, I was working with young children, kindergarten through second grade, roughly. And I was just doing speech therapy. And as I was working on their speech and improving their speech, the parents they were coming to me and they're saying, "What are you doing with my child? All of a sudden their reading and spelling at school has improved dramatically." So of course that makes sense. We know about the connection between phonological awareness. So what was happening was that through the work on oral language, we were developing phonological awareness that was transferring over to their reading and spelling. So that really was kind of an impetus for me to transition into literacy and get more interested, as well as to start developing commercial products around my academic expertise and both in language and literacy, which we know are inseparable. And so my first company was Cognitive Concepts, and that was the Earobics software back in the 1990s.
Yep,
And
I remember that.
Yeah, oldie but goodie. Yeah, I think you can still get them on eBay.
Yeah.
But yeah, they were CD-ROMs because of course CD-ROMs were the thing back then. And so that was the first company. And then in 2000, that company was acquired by Houghton Mifflin. And at that time, anyhow, we really knew that it wasn't just about the phonological awareness, and it wasn't just about letter sound correspondences. We really started to understand from the growing body of research about the real connections between all the language components, which we're going to talk about today, and even the importance of spelling. So that took me to my next company and commercial endeavor, which was the Spell Links products, which is word study and developing reading and writing skills, but all incorporating oral language because language is literacy. So that's kind of how I got to where I am today. And I've never gone back to just oral language and speech therapy. I love literacy work.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, when you think about the spelling component, it is really hard to unsee things? How can you talk about vocabulary and spelling without really, well, let me rephrase that. How can you talk about language and vocabulary and literacy without also thinking about pulling those two things together? I always felt like the orthographic component in my schooling, I knew that it was relevant to me as an SLP, but I find that there's a lot of confusion still, even in our field. Like, are we supposed to be working on this, or is this in our scope? So I'm wondering if you experience some of that as well.
Yeah. Now, are you specifically asking about the orthography?
Well, yeah, I mean, the
Yeah.
orthography and the role of the SLP. And I know that this
Yeah.
is, I mean, I think this is relevant to anyone working on literacy, but I think about that as just it, as the role of an SLP in the schools too.
As well, yeah, for sure, because orthography is just another form of language.
Mhm,
We think of language, spoken language, but of course that's language in spoken form, and then orthography is language in written form. And
mhm,
as I've developed my expertise in literacy over the years, to me the parallels between oral language and written
mhm,
language are so strong,
mhm.
which has really made it easy to learn and understand these concepts of language and orthography. But yeah, it's such an integral part of learning to
Mhm.
read and write, and it's such an integral part of language because it is a component of language.
Yeah, absolutely. So we, I think one of the good things is that now there is a push for, the science of reading is huge. It's all over now as far as like people are becoming aware of it. I know that this past year I was talking with a lot of people from different companies that are selling curriculum, and it's all about the science of reading, which whether or not they understand what that means is another story, but at least we understand, people are starting to understand that things like, look at the first letter and guess the rest of the word, or look at the picture and guess the word. Things like that are not going to promote good practices. So I'm glad that we're moving away from that. And I think one of the things that's the most common that I've seen is the reading rope. So the infographic with all the different components, but you have a framework called the Language Literacy Network where you've really expanded and elaborated on that. So I'd love if you could explain how it relates to the reading rope and how it expands, and just really what is the Language Literacy Network?
Yeah, and before I get to that, I just want to comment on something you said there about the science of reading. So
Yeah.
the science of reading, and now I'm using uppercase S, uppercase R.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I've
Yeah,
noticed. Is it uppercase or lowercase?
yeah. So I think the movement and certainly the buzzword is science of reading, and it
Yes.
has contributed greatly to
Mhm.
advancing both teacher
Yes.
knowledge as well as literacy practices. And you gave
Yep.
one really good example. But I think of the science of reading in lowercase s, lowercase
Yes.
r,
Yeah.
because the science, science has been evolving for decades
Hmm.
and decades and decades, and and not just reading but writing. And so to me, we've always had the science
Hmm.
for and about reading, and we've always had science for and about writing, but now it's finally being brought to the forefront, which is a very good thing.
Yep. Hmm.
And you notice I'm saying reading and writing because
Right.
so buzzwords like the science of reading, which again, I'm glad for the movement. It's really contributed a
Hmm.
lot, but it's
Hmm.
again putting the focus on reading. And really, it should
Hmm.
be the science of literacy and language.
Hmm.
And of course, literacy is language. But and that's what really took me to developing the Language Literacy Network, because we have decades and decades of research about reading and research about writing and research about language and how they all come together. And I really felt like I was actually in conversations with colleagues and they kept saying, well, we need a writing rope. We need a writing rope. And no, we don't, because first of all, there is a writing rope out there and it captures different elements and is good for what it is, but it loses the main essence of reading and writing are highly interconnected, integrated processes. So I set
Hmm.
out to create an illustration that would, at its core, really represent reading and writing. Number one as language processes. Number two as highly integrated processes, reciprocally related, and really bring it up to date. So the reading rope was first created and hasn't changed since it was created in 1992 by Dr. Hollis Scarborough. And to its credit, it was based on the research at the time. And to its credit, much of that research has held up over decades. But here we are more than 30 years later, and we have so much additional research because research science evolves. So that was really what I set out to do, is create something that represents our current understanding of the research in a visual form.
Yeah.
So that hopefully it would be easy for educators, practitioners of all stripes, whether they're a classroom teacher, special ed teacher, speech language pathologist, reading specialist, whatever. I like to say practitioners of all stripes.
Right.
For all of us to wrap our brains more easily around what's represented in the science and the research, and that is how these different processes integrate with each other, are functionally connected, and how that can lead us to better instruction.
Yeah. So I'd love to just go through and sort of get an overview of what it is, but some of the things that, I guess, questions or are topics that I have seen debated relating to reading, literacy, writing. So there's the question of where things like audiobooks fit in, and we know that vocabulary is really important. And I have seen people, because I am a proponent of audiobooks because vocabulary is so important. And whenever I bring up, they're great, this is a great tool. However, if we want kids to understand writing and print and spelling, we have to work on spelling and writing explicitly, and audiobooks don't necessarily do that. And the other thing that I've seen in schools, which I found a little concerning, is that, well, I've seen teachers that have said, well, this student does really well on reading comprehension. And what they were doing was reading a book to a student and verbally asking them questions, saying, well, she understands it when I read it to her. And that's great that student has listening comprehension, but that's not reading comprehension. You're not assessing reading. And if that's all you're doing, you're not giving that student an opportunity to practice reading. Not that what you're doing isn't useful, because I know that I've seen the audiobook thing, like, is it real reading, be kind of a heated debate. So I'm wondering if maybe when we go into that, the network, if that will kind of elaborate on some of that, or if you wanted to comment on some of those things now before we get into it.
Well, yeah, I think the Language Literacy Network will elaborate more, but I agree with you there. Audiobooks are great. And it's not even just for vocabulary development, but there's a lot of complex syntax.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, in written materials, which we are not exposed to just in our daily conversations. So I'm a fan of that. However, not to replace reading, because we want all learners to be independent readers and writers, and they won't become independent readers and writers and be empowered to read and write without explicit instruction. Plus, there's just a lot. There's a lot of our students, a good percentage of them, will require that explicit instruction, even in the syntax, even in the vocabulary, to really build on that. So yeah, so that might be a good segue to the Language Literacy Network.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll walk us through the illustration first, and throw in a few comments here and there, and then we can talk maybe more globally about it. So what I think is most striking when you first look at it is, well, let me just orient everybody to it. So what you'll see on the left-hand side is represents the reading skills. And if you're familiar with the reading rope, you'll kind of recognize some similarities, because again, a lot of the research that is represented in the reading rope has stood up over decades of research. So you'll see some similarities for sure, but you'll see some differences that I'll talk through in a minute. So reading is represented on the left-hand side with higher order reading comprehension skills represented by higher order language comprehension skills. And in the bottom left-hand corner, that's your foundational skills, your word level, word recognition, decoding skills. And then over on the right, and very different from the reading rope, we now also represent writing, the process of writing, and higher order skills on top for writing expression. First of all, oral language expression, which then is used for writing expression. And then on the bottom, we have the written word production. And so that's your spelling of words, your encoding. And so first of all, obviously, the most obvious differences are we now have reading and writing.
Yep.
And as you compare both sides, you'll notice that the language skills on both sides are virtually identical. We'll talk through some differences. And that's because whether we're reading or whether we're writing, we're tapping into the same underlying language skills, the same linguistic underpinnings. And so we just tap into them in different ways, but they're still tapped into. So they're the same skills. Let me talk about some differences. I'm going to focus on the right-hand side because I think most of your listeners are probably familiar with the reading rope. And as we know, we all learn best when we start with something we know and build from there. So if you're looking at the right-hand side, the reading side, you will see that I added the fifth circle bullet down. I added pragmatics. Now, as a speech language pathologist, Karen, you and I know that language is defined as form, content, and use. Well, form and content were already represented here. Form being, think about the syntactical structures, content being vocabulary, but use was not represented. So I wanted to make sure that was. I added pragmatics, and that could include things like the intended audience, the purpose of the author for writing. It could even tap into theory of mind, which is important for understanding characters and motivations within a story. Up on the top bullet under background knowledge, which we know is very important, critical for reading comprehension, I did add schemas because it isn't just about having knowledge, facts, and concept knowledge. It really schemas are organized units of knowledge. And we know that we learn best when knowledge is organized into units. So, different schemas and scripts might be the organized unit for an event. And so I added that. Down on the bottom in the foundational skills, phonological awareness, of course, is still very critical, but we now know about what's called orthographic awareness. That's taking knowledge of orthography to a conscious level and becoming aware of different patterns. And then morphological awareness, huge. So much research in the last 20 years, 10 to 20, really more 20 years about that. And then under decoding, I added, well, of course, now when we're decoding, it's not just about letter sound correspondences, it's about integrating meaning and morphology. And then I added flexible application because we need our students to know how to flexibly apply their linguistic knowledge, whether they're thinking about phonemes, letters, morphology, meaning, and all of that has to come together. So let me finish off on the reading side, and then Karen, I'm going to ask you if you want me to clarify anything there. But one major difference you're going to notice in the Language Literacy Network as you compare it to the reading rope is in the bottom left-hand corner under written word recognition, there is no fluency listed. And that's really key because we now, I don't know what was understood back in the 1992 on fluency, but we now understand fluency to be a outcome, not something you work on directly, but an outcome of the decoding process, an outcome of having phonological, orthographic, and morphological awareness and applying that to the task. And then, so as you'll see that the arrow going up then to the skilled reading, the arrow coming out of word recognition going upward, that's where we get our fluency. So it's building over time as we decode words and gradually we get fluency. So that's a key difference.
And that was one of the things that I specifically remember from watching one of your seminars, is the idea that all of these things are what contribute to, big air quotes, fluency. Fluency is not something where the main goal is fluency. And I see that where there is this push for accountability, and we have to make IEP goals, or even not IEP goals, just students who are working on reading and writing and literacy type skills, that it's focused more on what's internally happening, what are the underlying skills versus what is this end outcome over here, which, not that we're ignoring it. It's not that we're not paying attention to how fluently, again, to use that word, we're noticing it, but it's not really what we're focusing on, or it's not really what we are addressing. And I've seen that. I find that I make that distinction a lot with SLPs, even with comprehension too, because they're focused on these comprehension goals. And the reason that students don't have solid comprehension is maybe they don't have the syntactic skills to understand one sentence at a time, so they need that explicit work in syntax, or they can't answer a comprehension question when they read something out loud because the process of decoding is so laborious that they're devoting so many cognitive resources to trying to decode, and then they don't have anything left for comprehension. So of course, working on stating the main idea isn't working for them when they don't have these underlying skills. So I see a lot of these things all the time. One question I had, and I know that we have the left side of the infographic and the right side where we have reading and writing. When we think about what skills impact the other, do you find that there's this almost that they're interrelated, like working on reading impacts writing, working on writing impacts reading, or do some skills impact others more so?
Yeah, and so you'll notice in the center it's connected, and that's to indicate the bidirectional relationship. When we're talking about upper level skills, first of all, yes, improving reading comprehension improves language, writing expression. And improving writing expression goes the other way. And there does seem to be more of a carryover from writing to the reading. However, that bidirectional relationship between those higher order language skills is not as strong as the very strong bidirectional relationship between the foundational skills of decoding and encoding. And specifically, we have research that shows if you focus on the encoding, the spelling of words, and especially making sure students are writing, whether it's print or cursive, that's less important than writing versus typing versus letter tiles. Anyhow, that we have research that shows that students who are spelling will improve in spelling and improve in decoding skills. However, if you have them and teach them decoding and have them engage in decoding, if it's good instruction, good decoding instruction, yeah, they improve in decoding, but there isn't that same transfer. So we have instructional minutes are precious. We have such very little time with our students and so much to get done. So I like to think about it as, where are you going to get the biggest bang for your buck if it's working on spelling? Now, that doesn't mean you just work on spelling, but it becomes the gateway. It becomes the starting point. And then you also, within the same lesson, you're going to work on decoding. But there's just such a powerful transfer. So yeah, that has been documented. And it's believed that it might be because of that added modality, which you do see on the Language Literacy Network on the bottom right. You see I've added the transcription. You won't see transcription over on the left-hand side because it's not part of word recognition. But it's believed this this impact I described, this speech, what I call here, the speech to print advantage, it's been documented by multiple researchers. They've put out different hypotheses. We know it happens, but we're not quite sure why. But one of the hypotheses is because of the added modality of writing.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought that up because we're getting more and more tech-based, and there's a lot of technology available where you can verbally dictate something if you're writing it, which in some contexts might make sense, especially, I mean, depending on the scenario, but when you want students to specifically work on those skills, it kind of going back to the audiobook conversation of what skills are we working on? Is this useful? Does it make sense in certain contexts versus when we are specifically focused on teaching kids reading and spelling skills? Does it make sense in this context? And is it going to build the skills that students need?
Yeah.
I wanted to talk about the speech to print versus print to speech. And I know that that's a conversation as well, but it sounds like you were going to comment on something though.
Yeah, well, I was just going to also say, I was going to say that as you started talking about the whether students should be using dictation devices, I immediately went to that same analogy of the audiobooks. It's the same thing. There's a time and a place, but it's not going to help them learn how to encode words. And I always like to say, what you're doing really depends on, I say, why? What's your objective here? And when you know what your objective is, that should drive what you're doing and how you're doing it. And so that varies. But the speech to print, I'm sorry, did you have a specific question on that?
And again, I know that there are some very widely known approaches that work on reading that are more print to speech. And then I know that what you're talking about within the language literacy network, and I know with SpellLinks, it's more of a speech to print philosophy. So can you explain what, like, the differences between the two and why you've designed your specific frameworks the way that you have?
Yeah, so speech to print is another one of those buzzwords that is being maybe overused, and then it gets defined and used differently by different people. So I'm going to start with defining it the way I use the term and the way I think that the research represents. And that is, first of all, again, starting with spelling of words and coding of words as the gateway. You're still teaching decoding skills as well, but it's kind of what comes first. Again, even within the same lesson, what comes first. Also, and this is another big difference, it's how you organize your instruction. So for example, in a speech to print approach, or as I implement it based on the research, one example would be, how do you divide a word into syllables? And so, a print to speech approach would look at the letter patterns and would mark vowel, consonant, vowel, and would have a set of rules for where do you divide it. And so the word, I don't know, happy would be divided between the two P's, and that's very much a print to speech. Whereas in a speech to print world, because we're organizing everything around spoken language, we just leverage the biological wiring of the brain. So the brain is already biologically wired to say ha-p. We don't say hap E, and we certainly don't say hap P. So all of that is very artificial. And some students, they're going to learn no matter what you teach them, but the majority of students are going to struggle. And so why make it so difficult, and why not just leverage the way the oral language brain is already wired? And so we begin the instruction and really structure all the instruction around that. Now, I do want to clarify that SpellLinks, yes, we do use the speech to print approach, but it's much more than that. It represents really the language literacy network. It's multilinguistic, morphology, vocabulary, orthography, applications to reading and writing. It's also meta-linguistic, because we're really beginning to understand the power and importance of explicitly teaching our students specific strategies for decoding and encoding, yes, and even for comprehension and expression. But there's strategies, there's specific strategies, and they're what I call problem solving strategies.
Yeah.
So that students can be independent, because we can't teach them how to read and spell every word, but we can teach them how to apply a variety of linguistic components to correctly read and spell any word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a number of different questions based on what you said, but okay. So we were talking speech to print. Oh, I know where I wanted to go, and I'm glad you brought up the happy example, because one of the things that I have seen with I think it would be, if you're thinking about it from the underlying linguistic skills versus, let me divide this word up, like into the letter patterns, is the ION suffix. That's where often it's like, if you are doing it linguistically, it's ION. That's what the pattern is, versus a lot of spelling curriculums or materials that you see on, different commercially available products will put TION, CION, SION. Like, so you're making kids learn all these patterns that aren't really patterns, but really this is the pattern. And if you're looking at the word and dividing it up into morphemes, you're actually making it more confusing if you're putting that other letter onto the ION suffix. So that's something I see a lot, and an example that I frequently give about looking at the linguistic patterns in words when you're studying orthography versus, I don't know, I guess that would be a print to speech approach the other way. Is that?
Well, this touches into, or goes into, the importance of having our students being multilinguistic, meaning and metalinguistic, meaning
Yeah.
they can flexibly think about phonology, orthography, morphology. We don't give them those big terms. I say, let's think about sounds, letters, and meanings, right?
Yeah.
And so a word like vacation, now, if we are simply mapping the letters that go with the sounds coming out of our mouth, which is very much a part of a speech to print approach, then it's VA, VA, CA, shun, TION. However, while that is true, students also are going to need to learn that there's a base word. There's actually a root, right?
Right.
VDC, and then ATE, and then ION. So true, the morpheme is ION. And so they do need that knowledge and understanding as well. But that's why they have to be multilinguistic, and they have to be flexible, cognitively flexible, to think about all of these pieces.
Yeah.
But you're right, the ION is the suffix, not TION.
Yeah. And I find that one comes up a lot with, I mean, usually it's SHUN if they're spelling it, if they're still just learning how to spell. So I wanted to talk about, well, when you bring up the metalinguistic component, one of the criticisms that I have heard from other colleagues that are focusing more on the cognitive aspect and executive functioning and self-regulation are that a lot of reading curriculums, or the way that a lot of reading instruction is delivered, is that it doesn't have the emphasis on executive functioning. And to me, the way that I see the appropriate way to teach reading and writing in a way that also emphasizes executive functioning is, how you said, to be metalinguistic. And because with executive functioning, it's got to be so specific to the situation. General problem solving skills about hypothetical situations doesn't tend to be helpful. But if you're teaching problem solving skills relating to the task that you're doing, which is decoding a word, figuring out how to spell a word, that's where students can learn to develop that cognitive flexibility. So I was wondering if we could talk about some specific examples of when we're thinking about some of the practices that are done in spelling. One of them that I can think about is when a student comes to a word and they're not really sure what to do. They don't have a strategy there to sound it out, or they don't have a strategy that's in their toolkit to figure out, how might I spell this word? Or practices like sorting sorting letters and word parts without having the vocalization and getting that language piece in there when they're just kind of passively looking at letters. So I'd love for you to talk about some of those things and how we can be more metalinguistic about those tasks, which come up a lot for students and teachers.
Yeah, and there are two things you touched on there. One was the metalinguistic strategies, and then there's just the metalinguistic or being very aware at a very attentive, conscious level
Yeah.
of the linguistic properties. And so, and I think those two examples you gave, I'll talk about those first, and we could always go
Yeah.
back to strategies.
Yeah.
Right, and we have plenty of research that the more tuned into the detail, the linguistic detail of a word, whether it's the phonology, the orthography, or the meaning morphology, the stronger the learning. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why when we talk about the speech to print effect, that's one of the hypotheses that the researchers have put out there, is you need to be much more tuned into the orthographic detail of a word to spell it correctly than you do to read it correctly. So attention to detail is important. And so sorting, that's one of my, first of all, word sorts are powerful learning activities if done properly. But unfortunately, they're not. Typically students get words and they might be in these little boxes, and they cut up the boxes and then they have to sort them and tape them on paper into columns. And I think we've all seen this, and it becomes a big flurry of activity and art and glue and tape. And so, but I have a really great story to share on that. And basically there's no learning that we can know of that's taking place there. So I have a story to share. I was working with a student, Peter, who was in 4th grade, diagnosed with dyslexia. He also had what we now call developmental language disorder. And I saw him right after school at his school. I had a room there, and he would literally leave his 4th grade classroom, walk across the hall, be in my room for our session. And one day he came in with his spelling workbook, and he had homework where he was supposed to take his list of 20 words and sort them into columns, just writing the word under whatever column based on the letter pattern. And I said, well, look, Peter, we really need to do our work today. So initially I was going to use the words to teach the proper methods and what we're talking about, this meta awareness of linguistic properties of words. But I thought, I'm going to do a little experiment, because he was just determined. He's like, no, I just got to get this done, and then I'll be done with my homework for the day.
Yeah.
All right. So I said, okay, Peter, go ahead. I'm going to give you 5 minutes. Do your homework. So I watched him, and he wrote the words into the columns and got them all in the right column. And then we closed the book, and I said, okay, Peter, so let's talk about what you just did here. And he said, well, I wrote the words. Okay, great. How did you decide where to put them? Well, I looked at the letters. Okay, great. What was the common sound? Because they were organized by a vowel pattern, vowel sound. What was the common sound? Oh, I don't know. And then I told him the sound. I said, well, how are some different ways you could spell it? I don't know. And then I picked out one of the words that I didn't think he would know the meaning. And I said, well, okay, I'm going to read one of your words. What does that mean? I don't know. So he went through this activity, and there was no awareness of sounds, letters, and meanings. So we then turned that in. You could take a word sort and turn that into a very powerful activity simply by having the student, first of all, read the word out loud. And then as they write it into the proper column, because they do have to look at the letters, saying their sounds as they write their letters. And that's very important, that simultaneous learning. And then use all the words in sentences, or make a little story out of using them, and work on syntax and vocabulary. So all of that can be pulled together, but no, word sorts themselves, not very effective.
Yeah. And I think that the important piece there is that they can be effective when done, when you add all of those things there. I see that with some of those activities that where it is sorting, or it's more what is often referred to as decontextualized, that, well, the problem is that that's just a sliver of the activity. You're not doing the whole thing. So it's not that what you're doing is wrong. It's just incomplete. We need to add the other elements. And I find that with a lot of these a lot of language therapy type things, even when we talk about things like sorting things into categories or naming associations, which, yeah, if that's all you're doing, you're not going to see good generalization. But if you take it and expand it immediately after while you're doing that activity, then yes, it becomes way more powerful.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's how you're doing something. Word sorts, again, I think are very powerful. We have one in almost every lesson of spell links, but it's how you do it and then what you do with it, as you say, afterward, and how you tie other pieces into the activity and then tie that activity to other components of language and other important skills, because all of these skills, going back to the Language Literacy Network, what I've hopefully captured here in the illustration is this integration. All of these skills come together. There's no sequential process. There's not a developmental process where they learn some skills early on and then the others. It's a very integrated sounds, letters, and meanings at every step along the way.
So you said one thing there, the idea of it being sequential, and the idea of we have to learn things in stages. So do we have to learn phonology and have these skills mastered before we can move on to morphology, for example? I get that question a lot. So,
yeah,
and you're saying, no, the research doesn't suggest that.
Well, I mean, there is some progression for sure, but generally speaking, stage models are no longer supported. Connectionist or repertoire models, theories and models, which represent the functional connectivity of all of these skills, are prevalent at this time in terms of being most supported with the research. But you could bring in, for example, I wouldn't be teaching morphology. Well, you could bring in morphology as early as kindergarten, even when you're still working on encoding and decoding words, by using compound words. Compound words are multimorphemic. They have two morphemes that go together to make a single word. So you could, each one of these, phonology, orthography, morphology, does have its own progression from more simple to more complex. And so as the students are moving through the grades, yes, they're getting phonology, orthography, morphology across all grade levels, but all of those skills are moving in instruction and in use from more simple to more complex.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, because I have seen people get very and there's a lot of clinicians that with language, because it's so complex, it can be very overwhelming to figure out, how do I structure my therapy in a way that doesn't feel like it's all over the place? How do I figure out how to be a good supplement to the literacy instruction that's happening in the classroom, especially with students that need that explicit intervention? And I think that some people want this hierarchy of like, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this. And there is a progression, but it's not quite as clean, I would say, as people want to think, which I mean, honestly, I think that that's a good thing, because sometimes integrating those other components is what helps students move along. I mean, if you just focus on phonology, you're going to be missing out on a lot of other skills that students need in order to make those connections.
100%, because the brain, the brain is oral, biologically wired for oral language. And so we have all those connections that will continue to develop over time. But for reading and writing, the brain connections, what's called neurofunctional connectivity, that only develops through instruction, and it develops the best through good instruction. So, I mean, I've heard this said a lot on social media, but we're brain architects, or we're building the brain, brain, whatever. I can't remember exactly how it's said, but it's true. We are literally, through good instruction, through multilinguistic instruction that it connects very tightly and explicitly for many students, we are building neural connections in the brain. And that's, I didn't talk about this earlier, but in the Language Literacy Network, I chose a schematic to represent the brain. So if you look back at the Language Literacy Network, think of the big circles, as areas or systems in the brain. And you notice that they have the lines, and those would be your neural paths. And they're all connecting with each other. And even the higher order skills are connecting with the foundational skills. They're connecting in a bidirectional relationship from reading to writing. But the idea is that we're building the neural network through our instruction, but only through good instruction. Or
Right.
the better the instruction, the better connected the neural network is for reading and writing. That's a better way to say it.
Yeah. Are there any things that, I mean, there's a lot of things we could be focusing on explicitly. There's, so many different linguistic components. Are there any areas where we're not sure if focusing on certain skills will build spelling and reading? For example, like the origin of a word, the etymology, and like where does this word originate from, and what's the history of it? And which obviously is really interesting to talk about and could probably be beneficial. And again, certain things are beneficial in certain contexts, but is this something that we know is going to improve reading and spelling and writing?
Yeah, and I just want to highlight how you defined etymology, because that's how I define it, and that's how the dictionary defines it, but
Yeah.
it's the history and origin
Mm-hmm.
of a word. And no, there's no research available at this time for teaching etymology. Now, morphology, yes, but that's different, because
Mm-hmm.
now we're teaching letter meaning relationships. Like the ION letters are a suffix that have a specific meaning. LY has another specific meaning. That's morphology. And we have a lot of research over the last, again, 10 to 20 years about
Mm-hmm.
how critical it is. But no, I have yet to come across any research to support teaching etymology. Now, as a subject, in school for older
Right.
kids who have an interest, yes, but not
Mm-hmm.
for improving reading and writing skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's an important distinction, because there's a lot of things that it's always, well, is it effective? Is it effective for what? And we're talking about reading, spelling, writing. Maybe it's effective for learning about history and developing a passion for linguistics. It could, I'm sure, for people who have an affinity for that, be really interesting to discuss that. But yeah, I
Yeah,
have a hard time keeping track of all of that, to be honest.
right.
Is
And
it
well,
Latin, or is it like where, and history was never my strongest, but I always was strong more in the English and language arts. So I found that interesting that some people are drawn to both, but not
yeah,
everyone.
no, not everyone. And it goes back to, it depends. What's the goal here? Is it to
Hmm.
learn about the language or the history? Or yeah, well then that's great. But if the goal is to teach reading and writing to be effective readers and writers, no. You mentioned Latin roots, and I'm the same way. I mean, I generally will know a Latin root from a Greek root. It is important. The reason that they're kind of highlighted, I think, in some programs is that some of the roots don't change when they combine with a base word or another root. And so those are easier than others. But you don't have to know if it's a French or a Latin or a Greek. You just need to know about what's called morphological transparency, meaning that when you have a word and you add a morpheme to it, whether it's a suffix or a prefix, but when you add a suffix to it, let's say, as the example, transparency has to do with, does the phonological structure and or the orthographic structure of the base word change when you add that suffix? So, for example, in the word kind,
Hmm.
she is very kind. When I add the suffix ly, kindly, I still hear all the phonemes kind, and I see
Hmm.
all the letters in kindly. So that's what's called fully transparent. Those are the easiest. When this goes back to the progression. So when you're teaching morphology in the
Hmm.
early grades, you begin with transparent multimorphemic words. Then you move on to what are called semi-transparent, and that's where either the phonological structure of the base word changes or the orthographic changes. So if we have magic and we go to magician, well, the
Yeah.
letters are the same, they haven't changed, but the phonological structure has changed. That's semi-transparent. That's more challenging. So that's your progression. And then you have the fully opaque. So as an example there, we have please and pleasure.
Yeah.
The sounds change, please, pleasure, and the spelling, that E on please drops off, right, when we add that suffix. So both the phonology and the orthography change. So we do have research that show as you increase or decrease transparency, as you become more and more opaque, it is harder. And that should be a progression within morphological instruction. And that's how we organize it in spell links. And but you don't need to know if it's a French or a Greek root unless you want to know.
Yeah.
Our students don't need to know, that's for sure.
Yeah. And that's again I think that people who naturally catch on to some of those patterns that aren't as dependent on explicit instruction, maybe you wouldn't have to have that hierarchy. But I know we know for a lot of students, especially the students that end up on our caseloads, definitely need that. So, and you're saying that's part of what you would go through in spell links and working through that hierarchy and focusing on those skills.
100%. And then also combining that with when we are teaching morphemes, we teach those high frequency occurring morphemes. Certainly first, if there's time, we can always go into some of the lower frequency of occurrence, but which ones are they going to be bumping into in written text? Which ones are they more likely to be using in their oral, their written expression? So yes, that's another component of the progression. And so it's not unidimensional, it's very multidimensional expansion of skills that way in terms of the progression.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I know we've been talking for a while, and so I wanted to know where people can go to learn more about you and some of the. I know you've got a great discussion forum, your website, some of the programs that you offer. So yeah, where can people find you?
Yeah, so I do invite everyone to join Spell Talk, which is a free listserv, professional listserv, and I started it. It's almost 24 years since it began. We have a huge following. And what makes us unique is, well, first of all, it's a listserv and it's vetted. So it's not the noise of social media that some information on social media is great. Other is not. But anyhow, it's a vetted community. We have some of the leading researchers on there. We post new research abstracts and we discuss what I call overarching issues in current research and best practices for language and literacy. And then if you want to learn more about Spell Links and our products and services, including professional development, I have an entire webinar just on the Language Literacy Network. Anyhow, go to learningbydesign.com, learningbydesign.com, and you can learn everything you need to know.
Great. Well, we'll link to all of those in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. And thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places you can go to connect with Dr. Wasowicz, including the infographic for the Language Literacy Network, the place you can go to join the Spell Talk listserv, a professional discussion forum with leading literacy experts, as well as where you can learn more about learning by design. Also, remember that between September 15th and October 15th, you can get 25% off when you join either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. All you need to do to get that special rate is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page. The School of Clinical Leadership is my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about that program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And you can learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Here's what you can do right now to support the Reading is Fundamental campaign that's going on in the month of September and ensure you don't miss any of these amazing interviews and commentary. One thing you can do is go to Apple or Spotify or any other directory you use for podcasts and subscribe to the De Facto Leaders podcast. Once you listen to an episode or two, you can leave me a rating and review, which really helps to get my show into the hands of people who need the information. And if you have a colleague or friend who needs to learn more about the research surrounding language and literacy, or if you want to spread the word about practices and ideas you'd like to see in your school, community, or state, I encourage you to tell them about the De Facto Leaders podcast so they can listen to all of the episodes in this special series. Thank you, as always, for listening, and I will see you next time.